Hi everyone, it's John. I received a comment a few days ago by a commenter named Tea Time about them liking some of the books that I showed in my last book haul, I think. And I wanted to dedicate this video, I guess, to Tea Time, to him or her. Leave your pronoun below, please, so I can find out at least that much about you. And they commented that they liked the sort of different variety of books or something along those lines that I showed. And I replied, I know some of my interests are a bit niche and a bit nerdy, even for the nonfiction corner of BookTube that we inhabit that seems to be increasingly small, but that I would show some more books and sort of do it for Tea Time, since they seemed to enjoy what I was showing. So, in the spirit of getting a bit more ahead on showing you the things that I've bought recently, as I've said in the past couple of my book hauls, I've bought so many things over the past 6 or so months that it's really getting out of hand. If I make 6 or 7 more videos, in each of which I show you 10 books, I think I might be up to speed. But I don't want to post too many book hauls in a row because, as fun as they are, I'm sure they must get boring to watch. I don't know. Maybe comment and tell me how that would go. But I'm going to show you 10. And like I said, a bit niche, sometimes a bit weird and off the wall books that I read. A few of these I don't know too much about because I'll just really dive headfirst into a subject and order pretty much anything that I like that looks remotely interesting. And with several of these, I did precisely that. So, bearing all of that in mind, let's get started. This one is one I don't know too much about, other than to say it is about someone who fascinates me and someone whose ideas I always find perennially interesting. It's Freud. This is Freud's Discovery of Psychoanalysis, The Politics of Hysteria by William J. McGrath. This is not the title makes it sound like it's sort of a summary of Freud's ideas, but it's actually much more of a contextualization about the professionalization of psychoanalysis, some of his students, and some of the things that were concomitant with the development of psychoanalysis. Of course, it's not a recapitulation of Freud's ideas, but having some knowledge of Freud would certainly be helpful, and thankfully I do. Next up is a book of philosophy. This is Gregory Vlastos's Socrates, Ironist and Moral Philosopher. Vlastos was a very, very well-known figure. He taught at Princeton, I think, in the 60s and 70s, and then at Berkeley for the last decade and a half or so of his life, the 80s and some of the 90s. He was pretty much single-handedly known for reintroducing the importance of Socrates back into, I guess, philosophical discourse, and taking him seriously as a figure in and of himself, not mediated through any other literary figures like Plato. Just looking at Socrates, the Socratic and the Maieutic methods, and thinking about the questions that Socrates himself raises. Of course, as far as I know, we only have 2 sources for Socrates, Plato and Xenophon. So there's sort of limited takes that we can get on him, but he was really interested in ancient philosophy, especially the figure of Socrates, and this is a really seminal book by a pretty important thinker. So I didn't have it in my library and wanted to add it. Next up are two books by the same person. This one, I was sort of going through a American transcendentalist author's kick about 6 months ago, and was discovering a few names that I wasn't familiar with, and one of them was this guy. His name is Lawrence Buell. He is a professor at Harvard, and he wrote this book called New England Literary Culture from Revolution Through Renaissance. And by the way, the the Renaissance here, just like the Revolution, refers to the American literary Renaissance. So not anything European. We're talking about New England. So the Revolution being, the last, I guess, quarter of the 18th century, and the American literary Renaissance being roughly the middle third of the 19th century. This is going to be kind of a social and literary history of those, say, 60 to 75 years of the United States. And I know there is a lot of information in here about the Transcendentalists, which is was one of my biggest interests at the time, and remains to be one of my big interests. But there's also other stuff in here too. I mean, I hope he covers people like Washington Irving and stuff, but I haven't actually delved into it. But certainly want to, but have so many other things to read. And another book, also by Lawrence Buell, and you can probably tell why I'm interested in this. The Transcendentalist. If you know one or two of them, there's probably one. This is his probably better called an intellectual biography of Emerson instead of just a straight life. It's more idea oriented than anything else, but really looked fascinating, and skimming through it makes me want to read it all the more. So there's that. And I was sort of tittering around on the NYRB site a few weeks ago and saw that they had released a book that is not in the typical NYRB cover, with the well, everyone knows what they look like, right? This was something put out by them that looks completely different. And I don't know how that exactly went, why they chose to do that. This is called The Age of Conversation by Benedetta Kaveri. And this is basically, I want to say, 17th and 18th century. It's about the rise of coffee houses, and especially coffee houses as a place for the exchange of intellectual ideas, leading up to, the Enlightenment philosophes who would meet in public places like coffee houses and trade pamphlets and talk about books that they had read and art that they had seen, etc. So it's kind of about the rise of the social places in which ideas were exchanged. Other than that, I can't say too much about it, other than it is quite a thick book with a really, really wonderful biographical essay at the back. So a bibliographical essay at the back, excuse me. But I'm always interested in things like Enlightenment ideas and the social context around which those ideas were spread is especially interesting. So, okay, next is a book that you've probably heard of, at least probably a historian you've heard of. This is David Carradine's The Decline and Fall of the British Aristocracy, and it's exactly what the title says it is. It is about obviously not the fall of the monarchy, but which I'm sure some people are hoping for, but the fall of the aristocracy, and how they. It's interesting when you read in fiction. The later you go, you hear about the aristocracy sort of becoming increasingly decadent, and how you can have aristocratic titles in your family, but not really have much money, where that probably wouldn't have been the case so much 300 or 400 years ago. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it seemed to be getting more and more common. So this is the rather 800-page long, with notes and everything, history of that sort of decline and fall. He's obviously punning on Gibbon there, but next is another. This I actually found at the annex in my local library. Recognized the name of the biographer and swooped down to pick this up for a couple of dollars. This is Eisenhower in War and Peace by Jean Edward Smith. Again, pretty sizable, running at about 950 pages. So I can't tell you too much other than the fact that it's a biography of Eisenhower, and I'm pretty sure that I've never read one of those before by anyone. So this would be the first. This is a book that I had never heard of, by a writer I'd never heard of, but nevertheless is in a Penguin Classics version. And I thought I knew most of those, or certainly most of the ones that I would run across in your sort of everyday corporate chain bookstore. I found this at half-price books. This is Jean Lartegui's The Centurions. Lartegui apparently just died quite recently in 2011, but I think he fought in World War II, and for some reason the cover made me think that this was about World War I. It's most certainly not about World War I. But apparently Lartegui is most famous for writing about guerrilla tactics in warfare. And this is a novel that it is part of a trilogy. It's the second in a trilogy, but this is the most famous one of the three. That is about guerrilla warfare, non-traditional warfare, and I think I read somewhere that Lartegui is responsible for coining the term ticking time bomb. And there's apparently a depiction of one in this novel. So novelizations of war are always interesting. So especially was sort of turned on by the fact that it was a Penguin Classics I'd never heard of. So that pushed me forward all the more to get this. This is one of two recent books that I have purchased by Adam Zamoyski. Zamoyski writes a lot about Poland and he writes a lot about Napoleon. Well, has written at least 2 books around Napoleonic era history. This being maybe, well, certainly historically, in chronological order, this would be the second one. This is Rights of Peace, the Fall of Napoleon, and the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna took place in 1815 in the city of Vienna, surprise, surprise, and it was basically, its purpose was to reconstruct Europe after the havoc that Napoleon had wreaked upon it. I have another book by Zamoyski, which is about Napoleon's 1812 campaign on Moscow and how horribly that turned out for him, where he had to sort of turn back and go home because of the horrible weather and inclement conditions and other things. But this is about the rebuilding of a European peace, which was, with all of the major figures too. So it's not only a retelling of the Congress of Vienna, but you hear about Metternich and all of these wonderful diplomats from the early part of the 19th century, whose ideas and sort of ways they thought about an emerging modern Europe would influence Europe even down to today. And this, if you want to really draw some lines, you could even draw lines from this book to the Brexit debate if you wanted to, and not have it be too much of a stretch either. So this book and the other book by Zamoyski, which I haven't showed you yet, but I'll show you in a future book haul. This looks very good. And last but not least, one of my favorite historians is a man by the name of J.G.A. Pocock. He's still around. He's in his 90s. And he writes mostly on, I guess, the transition from Renaissance to modern Italy, especially constitutionalism, republicanism, especially republicanism in Florence. I discovered a few months ago that he had published this multi-volume work called Barbarism and Religion. Now, many of them are just extremely expensive. I'm talking, $30 and $40 per volume. But I found volume 2 for $10 in brand new condition and bought it. It's certainly not something that you have to read in order, but this is Pocock's, like I said, J.G.A. Pocock's Barbarism and Religion, Volume 2, Narratives of Civil Government. This is his, I think it's 5 or 6 volumes. It's not a reading of Gibbon, his Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's not a reading of him. It is a contextualization, a 5 or 6 volume contextualization of Gibbon. And volume 2 happens to be all about assumptions and the historiography of assumptions of civil government around the time when Gibbon was writing. So, late 18th century. I was just sort of fascinated because there are so many ideas and historians and books that he sort of talks about in here that I, haven't really had a chance to look at myself. He has, for example, an entire section that's 80 pages long, just talking about Hume's The History of Great Britain and England under the House of Tudor. And he talks about how all of these different historians and historiographers have thought about civil governance and civil religion, civil government. So, as soon as those other volumes become slightly less expensive, and if they don't, I'm just going to be forced to pay $30 a piece for them, because there's no way I can go without this entire set. But apparently Pocock came out with these in quick succession over a period of maybe like 8 or 10 years. And the man was writing these in his 80s and 90s. And it is just chock full of just brilliant, heady, wonderful information. So it's right up my alley. That is number 10. And that's all I have to show you. So maybe next time I can actually do a book review. I've had a chance to do tons of reading in the past few weeks, thanks to the holiday. I've had a chance to finish, I think, 6 or 7 books, which is much more than I ever usually get a chance to read in a normal month. But I will try to review one of those and talk about it in my next video. I will see you guys then. Bye.